Anyone who knows ball and watched Georgia play a year ago knows that the defensive line play was not up to the Georgia standard. You don't need me to tell you that. And it's not that the defensive line play was bad necessarily. It was actually good. It was very solid relative to the rest of the country. But at the same time, it also wasn't elite. And elite is what we have become accustomed to from Georgia defensive lines. But despite a down year relative to Georgia standards, with a strong group of returning veterans and an extremely talented crop of younger players, the Georgia defensive line is poised for a resurgent season in 2024 and will look far more like the Georgia defensive lines from 21 and 22 that spearheaded back-to-back national championship runs than what we saw a year ago.
We just stepped on their face with a hobnail boot and broke their nose. We just crushed their face.
What's up, guys? I'm Tyler, and this is Glory UGA Plus, brought to you by our wonderful friends at Alumni Hall, and I am back on the preview train today, continuing my preview of Georgia's position units heading into fall camp, which now is just 2 short days away. So if you are into this type of hardcore Georgia football talk, if you haven't already, you're going to want to go ahead and subscribe to this channel right now so you'll get all of our coverage leading up to the start of the season and, of course, throughout the entire 2024 season. So subscribe, like, comment, and definitely check out the Glory UGA podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast for a whole lot more coverage of Georgia football throughout this 2024 season. So check that out, guys. But all right, let's break down this 2024 Georgia defensive line. We're going to look at the depth chart, the outlook, the biggest questions, maybe some sleepers, all of the above. But we're going to start on the interior of the defensive line. And to me, at the top of this group, it's pretty clear. It's pretty obvious. We have 2 returning veterans at the 0 tech and the 3 tech who have played a lot of football for Georgia over the years. 2 guys going into their 5th years in Athens, Warren Brinson and Nazir Stackhouse. Naz is your 0 tech nose guard, and Warren Brinson is more of your 3 tech guy. Warren at 6'4", 305, Nazir 6'3", about 320. Brinson actually only started 4 games last year, but was a major part of the Georgia defensive line last year, also back in 2022 as well, but not as much when you got Jalen Carter, man, in that position. But last year, he took on a new role and played a lot more for Georgia than he had at any point in his career. Stackhouse has started every single game for the Bulldogs each of the last 2 seasons. So that's 29 consecutive games. He has played a lot in recent years. Both those guys are obviously veterans on the Georgia defensive line. And at this point in their career, going into their 5th season in Athens, we pretty much know who these guys are. We know who they are. We know that they are good, solid SEC players, but not elite. I think we can say that, guys. That's not a knock on them. They're really good players and done a lot of really good things for Georgia, but are they elite? No. Elite is Jordan Davis, is Jalen Carter, is Devontae Wyatt back in 2021. And while Brinson and Nas have been really good, they haven't been that, right? So we kind of know who they are. And look, I mean, when you're going into your 5th year on campus, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's rare when you have players who have played as much as these 2 guys have, that they're just going to come into their final year on campus, their COVID year for these 2 guys, and just explode in their 5th season and take their game to all of a sudden like crazy new heights that we just haven't seen from them before. I hope that's the case. I hope that happens, but we also have to be realistic and realize that's pretty rare. That's not usually how this works out. So if those right now ahead of the season are probably the guys who will open the season as the starters at the 0 tech and the 3 tech respectively, if that's the case, then why did I tell you at the outset that this is going to be a resurgent season for the Georgia defensive line? If I don't think those guys are elite and they're probably going to start for Georgia, at least against Clemson, probably most of the year, why is this going to be a resurgent season? Like, what am I even talking about? Well, Nas and Brinson are a part of it. They are very strong building blocks. They bring stability to your defensive line. But the reason that I believe that this Georgia defensive line is going to take a step forward this year, sure, Nas and Warren, they can improve their game to a degree, but the real reason I believe we're going to see a resurgence from the Georgia defensive line in 2024 is the development of the younger players on that defensive line. The Christian Millers, the Jordan Halls, the Jamal Jarrett's of the world, maybe even the Xavier McLeods of the world, the transfer coming over from South Carolina. Those are the players, in my opinion, my humble opinion, that have the potential to play closer to the Jordan Davises and the Jalen Carters, the Devontae Wyatts of the world. I'm not saying they'll be those guys. Hear me out on that, guys. Like, people oftentimes like to just take what people say and run with it. So let's be careful here. I'm not saying that Christian Miller or Jordan Hall is going to be Jalen Carter this year, but I do think that their ceiling, their potential, if they get close to that, is closer to Jalen Carter, Devontae Wyatt, or Jordan Davis than what Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson have. That's what I'm saying. Those guys, the younger players, they were the most physically gifted defensive linemen on the team, the interior guys on the team last year. The problem was they were just young. They just weren't quite ready to be those guys yet. All of those guys were in their first year playing on the field for Georgia. I know Christian Miller was a redshirt freshman. He didn't really play at all his true freshman year. So he was getting his first real taste of SEC football. Jordan Hall was a true freshman. Jamal Jarrett, a true freshman. Those guys were just young, but the potential is there. The physical ability is there in a way that I don't think it's quite there for Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson, although, of course, they are still very, very good players. So the upside is there for all three of those guys. And again, you can throw in Xavier McLeod, the transfer from South Carolina, as well. And so I think that if we're talking about the biggest questions on this Georgia defensive line, and really one of the biggest questions on this entire team heading into the 2024 season, are those younger guys, Christian Miller, Jordan Hall, Jamal Jarrett, maybe Xavier McLeod, are they ready to take that next step, to take their game to that next level? If that is the case, if the answer to that question is yes, then the Georgia defensive line absolutely will be a lot better this year because those guys have that type of potential. Now, will they take that step? We don't know. We can't answer that definitively right now, but we're doing projections right now, guys. That's all we can do right now. So for my money, if I'm making a projection, I think the answer is yes. And I base that on what we saw from these guys as the season progressed last year, especially from Christian Miller. Warren Brinson went down in the Ole Miss game. Miller came in and played a lot late in that game and played really, really well against the Rebels, and then started the game against Tennessee, played really well in that game. You start to see Jamal Jarrett come on late in the season. Early in the year, he just wasn't ready physically, guys. His body wasn't in shape. He had to get ready to play SEC football. He was huge, but not ready. By the end of the year, when he got some garbage time, especially in that Orange Bowl against Florida State, you saw a different guy who could play more sustained snaps, a guy that could actually go out there and run down the line of scrimmage, which early in the year, he wasn't doing that. His body wasn't there. And we saw that progression continue during spring practice. I know we don't get to see much. We see G-Day, and it's one isolated setting, but we saw what we need to see from all of those guys, including Xavier McLeod, in that one isolated setting. So the signs are there, and my opinion is yes, in year two for all these guys, for Christian Miller, year three in the system, but year two of actually playing, I believe they are in line to take a big step. So where do they factor in? So I do think Nazir Stackhouse will open as the starter. I mean, he's going to what will be presumptively his third year as a starter, so I expect him to be the starter at the 0 tech. I expect Warren Brinson fully to be the starter at the 3 tech. But I think if you look at Christian Miller, he's a guy that last year, when Zion Logue was on the team, so you had Zion Logue and Warren Brinson, who were the primary options at that 3 tech. And they could play a little 0 tech situation depending on the package we were working with. But it was really Nazir Stackhouse, and backing up Nazir Stackhouse, we had Christian Miller. And that was basically out of necessity. Guys, Christian Miller is not a 0 tech body. He is 6'4", 305, which is basically exactly what Warren Brinson is, and Brinson's a 3 tech all the way. Christian Miller is a 3 tech, guys, but out of necessity, because Jamal Jarrett wasn't ready, we had to play him at 0 tech. Now, he did play some 3, but he played majority of his snaps, especially early in the year, as a 0 tech. I mean, he's not a big Jordan Davis-esque space seater. That's not what this guy does. He's a penetrator. He's a disruptor. He's got elite quickness off the ball, twitch, strong at the point of attack, yes, which is why he could function at the 0 tech, but that's not what he will play in the NFL. He is a 3 tech guy. And this year, with what I believe will be Jamal Jarrett taking the step, if Jamal Jarrett can emerge and take some of those backup reps from Christian Miller and play that zero tech, that frees up Christian Miller to play his much more natural position of the 3 tech right there behind Warren Brinson. Maybe even split reps with Warren Brinson. So I think you'll see a lot of Christian Miller this year. I think you'll see a lot of him at a more natural position for him, which is at the 3 tech, which I believe will make him a much more effective defensive lineman for us this year. Now, Jordan Hall is an interesting guy. So he did play a lot of 3 tech last year, but he's bigger. He's 6'4", 320. And when I say a lot of his snaps came at 3 tech. He didn't play a ton last year. But at 6'4", 320, he's a guy that certainly has the athleticism to play 3 tech. We saw that last year. But at 320, I mean, he can also slide over and play a little zero tech for you. I don't think that's really his best position, but he has the size, the strength to be able to do that. Jamal Jarrett, though, at 6'5", 350, he is a guy that's a zero tech all the way. That is what we recruited that guy for. We recruited him to be a Jordan Davis type player for us on the interior. He just was not ready last year. This year, will he be ready? Again, we can't say definitively, but we've seen positive signs that he is developing and trending in the right direction to be able to play some snaps for us this year. Now, the sleeper on the interior of our defensive line is a guy I've mentioned a couple of times, and it's the transfer from South Carolina, Xavier McLeod, who was a guy that we recruited. He was a pretty highly rated recruit coming out of high school, a 4-star guy. Ends up going to South Carolina. Didn't work out for him there. Really didn't end well. He was on their team for about half the season, about midway through the year. He left the team, whether he was dismissed or was a mutual parting of ways. Like, that's up for debate. It just depends on whose side of the story you're looking at there. But regardless, he left the team about midway through the year. So he's a guy that, as a young player, didn't get a ton of reps. He was only on a college roster for half a year last year. So he missed a ton of developmental reps, which is a young guy you need. He got more of those. He was here as an early enrollee in the spring, got a lot of reps, working with the 2s at G-Day. But man, while he's got a ways to go, he's still got to continue to develop and become more consistent. You saw flashes of elite potential. He's just got to bottle up and do it more consistently. So I am not going into this year expecting Xavier McLeod to be a major contributor. But at the same time, it wouldn't shock me if he starts to play some serious snaps for Georgia based off what I saw from him at G-Day. Again, I know. We don't want to draw definitive conclusions from a spring scrimmage, but I saw some really positive signs for him, and we know what Trey Scott has been able to do developing these guys along the defensive line. And he's got the tools, man. So I think he might factor in there as well. So put that name in your back pocket. Then you have some younger guys, true freshmen, who I don't count on at all. I don't count on true freshmen at any position, certainly the defensive line, because you're going against grown men. You guys know how I feel about that. We talked about with the offensive line. But Nazir Johnson is going to be a big-time player for Georgia. We're able to flip him late in the cycle. 6'6", 335. I believe he is a zero-tech nose guard all the way. Can he be a guy that can maybe surpass Jamal Jarrett? I mean, obviously, Ja's got a year on him, but, I mean, Nazir Johnson's really talented. So we'll see how he develops through the course of fall camps. The name to watch, Jordan Thomas, 6'5", 325, can play some zero. I think he's more of a 3-tech guy. So, again, I don't expect either one of those guys to really play much at all for Georgia this year, but you never know. You never know. They're both really talented players, so just also keep them in the back pocket there. But, all right, that's the interior. But that's not the entirety of the Georgia defensive line. We still have to talk about the 5-tech defensive end spot, and this is where it gets really interesting. On the surface, this is Michael Williams' job, okay? It's his job, right? That's where he has played primarily his first 2 years in Athens. Now, he was in a rotation there. We had Shamel Walthour. We had TID at times last year, but that was his primary position. Now, late in the year, especially in the Orange Bowl, we started to move him, give him some more opportunities to play the jack linebacker, and there was a lot made out of the fact that he was going to move to the jack linebacker in 2024. Well, spring came, in the first week of spring practice, we hear from Michael himself, who says, "Oh yeah, I'm playing 5-tech, but I'm also spending some time working with the outside linebackers." So it's like, oh, so you're not actually making like a full-time move. That wasn't quite clear. We got some clarity on that. He's still playing both, right? So Michael is going to play the 5-tech. At times this year, I imagine it'll be situationally. What that looks like and what situations do we have at the 5-tech, that's still very much up for debate. But it makes sense why you want to move him to jack. This guy is going to make his money in the NFL based off his pass rush ability, right? The 5-tech defensive end spot in our scheme is not a glamour pass rush position. It's a do the dirty work type spot. That's what it really is. Now, we can move guys around situationally, especially on third downs, to get them matched up in better pass rush situations. But on standard downs, if you're playing the 5-tech, rushing the passer is not your primary responsibility. So obviously Michael himself, I'm assuming, wanted to play more jack for his NFL profile. And look, we need to beef up our pass rush, guys, our natural pass rush, without having to like bring guys from different spots on the field. And Michael is the guy that can help solve that if you can play jack. And also, if you can get him at jack and you've got TID at the 5 tech, we know some of the issues that we had defending edge runs last year, the perimeter runs. That would potentially clean that up real quick. So I'm very curious to see exactly how much 5 tech, exactly how much jack that Michael's going to play. What situations is he playing both positions? We'll see that. But that brings us to, for me, the second biggest question for this Georgia defensive line heading into fall camp. Can a now healthy Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, TID, take a step and become a difference maker for Georgia at the 5 tech? 6'5", 280, was a former 5-star guy, at least by 247 Sports. I think the composite, he was a top 100-ish level guy, but 247 had him as a, I think, top 20 guy. But regardless, very highly rated guy. Years ago now, we were all very excited to get this guy, and it hasn't quite worked out for him because it's not really much his fault. He's been behind some studs for a couple of years, and then he was banged up last year, and when he came back in the Florida game, he was still nursing a foot injury. He was playing, but wasn't close to 100%. Had offseason surgery to clear up that foot injury, missed the spring, most of the spring, and now should be ready to go for fall camp. So can a now healthy, finally a healthy Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, who did some good things last year, even though he wasn't fully healthy, can he take that step and be much closer to the 5-star prospect he was coming out of high school? I think that's really, really important. Because ideally, I don't know this for sure, but I imagine, my speculation here is that ideally we would like to have Michael Williams play a lot more jack for us. I think that there's a reason why you heard that conversation heading into the Orange Bowl in the early parts of the offseason. I think we want him to be able to play more jack. But for us to be able to do that, we need somebody to step up at the 5 tech. It'd be far easier to move Michael more to the jack position, give him more snaps there, if we have a guy at the 5 who is playing at a high level. And I think TID at this time is the most likely candidate there. I think he's the obvious candidate. So I expect him to be a co-starter of sorts. Against some teams, maybe a starter. We'll see how that progresses, but play a ton of snaps for us. The top option behind Michael Williams at the 5 tech. So what's behind him? Well, that's where it gets a little bit interesting too. So we have a couple of young guys. So Gabe Harris is a guy that was a part of the 2023 recruiting class, the number 1 ranked 2023 recruiting class. And I'm sorry, the number 2 ranked 2023 recruiting class. Just get that right. And Gabe Harris came in as an edge rusher, like as a jack. But we really, nowadays, we only play one of those guys at a time. Like the vast majority of the time, we rarely in our base 3-4 package. That's just a rarity these days with how offenses have evolved. So we usually have one of those guys on the field. So if Michael is playing more over there, you still have Chaz Chambliss, you've got Damon Wilson Jr., you've got Samuel Mpemba, and it's like, okay, well, where does Gabe Harris fit in there? So as the season progressed last year, when he got some time, Gabe Harris started to play a little bit more 5 tech. He was actually playing defensive end and not so much jack for us. And that continued throughout spring practice. Now, he can do a little bit of both, but he got a lot of time at G-Day playing that 5 tech. Now, I have some questions there because he's not the predictable size of a 5 tech guy. I mean, he's 6'4", 245, which is much more in line with what you see from our jack linebackers, which is what he was recruited as initially. Now, has he added weight? Has he grown coming this season? I would hope so if he's going to play 5 tech, because you're talking about guys who are like 280, 285 for us playing that 5 tech spot. He's not there. Now, he does bring us something a little different. He gives us a much more dynamic pass rush off the edge, but I do have serious questions about his ability to hold up against the run at defensive end. Now, I imagine if he hasn't added a lot of weight, we would use him situationally there. He's not going to be a guy that's going to be playing a lot of standard downs where you're going to have to play the run more at the 5 tech, but he's an option there that can give us something a little bit different than maybe TID can. And then the guy that I'm in love with, you guys know if you've been with us for a while, you know you've heard me talk about this guy in this number 1 ranked 2024 recruiting class, JJA, Joseph Jonah Ajanye, 5-star prospect out of Texas. Hasn't been playing football for a long time, but his physical tools, guys, I mean, off the charts. Off the charts. But he's a freshman. And again, I'll go back to what I said about freshmen. I try to resist expecting anything from freshmen, but I have a really hard time resisting it from Joseph Jonah Ajanye right now. Because again, I think Mike doesn't play a lot of jack. Well, what does that leave us at the 5 tech? Well, you got TID, very confident in him. But what's behind him? Well, you got Gabe Harris, who's not really a 5-tech, and then it's Joseph Jonah-Janye. It's JJA. This dude's going to have to get ready to play. Now, he was a freshman during spring practice. He was an early enroll. He got a lot of reps, which was really helpful for his development with TID missing the spring with recovering from that foot injury. So I'm hopeful that he actually can help us this year. Again, I hesitate, kind of breaking my own rule here. Don't want to count on young guys. And it's not that we're counting him to start, but he could be a really important depth piece for us. And look, TID has that injury history. We might actually need JJA to play a lot for us this year. And as the season progresses, he's a guy that I expect to get a lot better. It's just a matter of learning the system. The athleticism's off the charts. Has a lot of natural strength. Very, very high. I think he's going to be the next great 5-tech for us in the coming years. So really, really love him. He's got to be my sleeper at the 5-tech. So let's summarize here. Let's do the math here. So yeah, if you look at the Georgia defensive line, it's largely the same guys as last year, with the exception of like Joseph Jonah-Janye and Xavier McLeod coming over from South Carolina. So, but other than that, basically the same guys. You have two very experienced guys, Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson, on the interior to stabilize the interior, bringing that veteran presence on the interior of our defensive line. But then you have 3 to 4 extremely talented, high upside young players on that defensive line who, if they can take a step, man, could change the game for the Georgia defensive line. And I fully expect them to be much more of a factor this year than they were a year ago. You still have a probable top 10 draft pick in Mykel Williams at the 5-tech. And how much 5-tech he plays, I don't know, but he'll play some there. And then you finally have a former 5-star who's finally ready in Tyron Ingram-Dawkins to take that step, in my opinion, and at least split reps, share those reps with Mykel at the 5-tech. You have a freakish freshman in Joseph Jonah-Janye and a versatile pass rusher in Gabe Harris who can be a weapon in certain situations. So, look, I don't expect this Georgia defensive line in 2024 to be what we saw in 2021. All right, that's not what I'm telling you. That was an all-timer. Like, that's not going to happen this year. But with all the returning pieces and all the uber-talented young players poised to take another step and take their games to another level this year, I do very much believe, firmly believe, the Georgia defensive line will be much better this season than it was a year ago, and much more in line with our expectations for Georgia defensive lines. And that means that we will see a return to dominance for the Georgia run defense, which took a major step back last year, and in my opinion, was the one biggest reason, if you had to pinpoint one, the one biggest reason that Georgia did not three-peat last year. But yeah, I believe we're going to see a resurgent season from the Georgia defensive line, and that will answer a lot of questions for this Georgia team. But all right, guys, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I greatly appreciate it. If you like this type of hardcore Georgia football talk, in-depth Georgia football talk, make sure to subscribe right now if you haven't already. Like, subscribe, and check out the Glory UGA podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever to get a lot more coverage like this. But thank you. I'm Tyler, and as always, go Dogs.
Man, is there going to be some property destroyed tonight. 26-21. Dogs on top.